Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Turnaround Talks' first roundtable discussion of the year. My name is Jonathan Faree, and I'm the editor of Turnaround Talk. Joining me today is a panel of experts who will be introduced shortly. This is a recorded session, so please remain on mute and switch off your videos. So only the panel and myself are allowed to have our videos on, obviously bandwidth permitting. And like I said, this is a recorded session which will be made available on our websites. Look, South Africa is in a desperate need for economic reform. There is no doubt about that. And President Cyril Ramaphosa has indicated that the private sector will play a major role in driving this reform. So the big question, I suppose, at the moment then is, how do we turn South Africa around? Joining me is first up is Asa Mahlanga, who is the chief economist at Alexander Forbes, and he will be discussing the current and future economic outlook for South Africa. Asa, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think from a macroeconomic point of view, we are in an environment that is quite not conducive now from where we're coming from last year. Global growth is moderating quite significantly so this year and next year. At least for this year, we are still at potential. Next year, we move below potential in most of our major trading partners. On average, 4.4% this year, moving slightly to about 3.8% next year. If we look in terms of what that means, we had expected commodity prices to moderate, which was going to be negative for South Africa's terms of trade. But now that has been upended by what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, where commodity prices have been doing quite well, and they're likely to continue doing so for the next couple of months, let's say for much of the remainder of the year. That is a blessing in disguise, given that these commodity prices are not driven by fundamental economic growth improvement, but by supply constraints that are going to come out of the war that's taking place. So far for SA's fundamentals, they still remain quite weak. A 2% economic growth this year, with even downside risks if we don't see reforms, which we're going to talk about now. But our forecast is roughly 2% over the medium term. And that is hardly enough to be able to reduce the unemployment rate that we have, 35% so far. And at 2% economic growth, we'll continue to see the unemployment rate continue to rise. So it's not enough to absorb all the young people that are coming out of our institutions looking for jobs. So we really need an economic growth rate of at least 3% on a sustained basis. We no longer have much support from fiscal policy, given that we are consolidating, trying to reduce our fiscal deficit and our debt levels, which is what came out of the budget. Essentially, its role was to first cushion, provide relief to households, provide relief to corporates, or to signal to corporates that South Africa is open for business. Business is at the center of the economic revival. But second, deal with the public sector wage settlements from last year, some 20.5 billion, and also the COVID relief grant extension of that 350 monthly COVID relief grant. That's costing about 44 billion. Once that have been taken care of, the extra tax revenues that have been collected, 182 billion, will then be used to whatever that is left is going to be used to reduce our debt and our fiscal deficit, and then as a result, consolidate sooner than what was expected. So a year earlier and at a lower debt level than what was expected. This is quite important to signal to capital, whether domestic or foreign, to say we will manage our fiscus in a more prudent manner, and as a result, you should not worry about potential defaults on our debt. That should help to build confidence. So that is the background. As far as the macroeconomy is concerned, the fiscal policy also no longer supportive, and monetary policy, like the rest of the world, we are starting to We will continue to see interest rates increasing in line with what is expected in the US, but obviously the inflation dynamics locally and offshore are a little bit different. Yes, from an energy price point of view, it's a global phenomenon. Oil prices are up, but electricity prices in general are also up. But what is different is in the advanced economies, we have demand pull inflation. In the local economy, we do not have demand pull inflation. And that you see by just looking at the difference between headline inflation and core inflation. Headline is above 5%, core inflation is still well below 4.5%. So that tells us we don't have a demand pull inflation in this economy. So the South African Reserve Bank will hike interest rates, not necessarily to control inflation because it's still quite muted, but to normalize, in line with what we see in the rest of the world, to make sure that we continue to remain competitive from a real yield point of view, and we can continue to attract capital flows that are required in the domestic. Macro point of view, let me perhaps stop there, and then I can come back later on as the discussion continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asa. Hopefully, we can also talk a little bit later on what the future economic outlook is for South Africa, sort of going forward and beyond this year after the ANC has had their policy conference and the electoral conference. JP Luntman is a political analyst and will be discussing the current and future political landscape that we currently face and experience in South Africa. JP, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Jonathan. I think Isaiah has sketched the macro position very clearly and very succinctly, both domestically and internationally. Things were difficult at any rate before the Ukraine war, before the Ukraine invasion, rather. And I think it's going to be much more difficult after that. We already see that in energy prices, as he has pointed out, wheat prices, there's something coming down the line, which is fertilizer. We may find that there's not enough fertilizer supply or alternatively, and that the price of fertilizer can jump quite significantly because Russia is a big supplier of that. So we have to start thinking about the possibility of food insecurity in large parts of the world. So the international and domestic scene is not the positive one. That stands to reason. So where will growth come from? What will turn the economy around? That's really the point that you wanted to discuss this afternoon. And I see only one road out of the current quagmire in which we find ourselves, and that is deep structural reform. Now, we are politically in the very fortunate condition that we have a government which is really committed to structural reform. They've said so in terms of spectrum release, in terms of allowing the private sector into transport. Is of course the biggest one of all is what's happening in electricity and energy. All in all, the government has given us 8 pillars of structural reform that they want to pursue. And I wonder if I can just, Jonathan, share a slide on that, just to give a feel for what it is. Would that help?
Yes, it would, JP. I'm just multiple participants can share, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, let me just do that. Okay, and let me now just go to presentation mode. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see.
Yes, we can see it. Sorry.
Thank you. The first part of the government's reform is a very obvious one. It's a little bit like saying the sun shines in daytime, and that is to maintain macroeconomic stability. And we've got huge commitments to that. The Isaiah has referred to the wage agreement in the civil service public sector that must still be finalized. But if you look there, then you see at least a strong political commitment to do the things that needs to be done. But it's not just that. It covers the whole area of fiscal and monetary policy. There's public employment, which mustn't be confused with civil service employment. I think that has now run about as far as it can. You can only do that by taking money from the fiscus and paying people a stipend. The stipend at the moment is 3,500 Rand a month. And there you see the numbers. We've got about 850,000 people in that program. Then there's energy, there's transport logistics that I've referred to. There is the infrastructure investment through the SIPS program. There is spectrum. There is attempts to promote localization or local industrial growth. And you can see the details there from personal protective equipment through to cannabis that may have a positive input. And there's the ease of doing business with some detail on what is meant there. The really big action is to be found in those two areas. Spectrum allocation, now tomorrow is the 8th of March. Let's see whether the auction goes ahead tomorrow morning or tomorrow. If it does, I think it will be a huge boost to confidence. It will be a huge boost to investments. The 6 companies who've put in bids or indicated that they're going to bid will invest quite a lot of billions into setting up the infrastructure and making use of the spectrum. And the other one is energy. And we can talk through the detail if you want to, but it's quite clear that energy investments over the next 10 years in South Africa are going to exceed R1 trillion. And that is before we talk hydrogen. That is just to build new renewable and storage and other capacity to solve South Africa's electricity crisis. Will load shedding still be with us for 2022? Yes, it will be. But I think that shouldn't take our eye off what is possible in future because of investments that are currently being made. Just to put it in perspective, load shedding is caused because we have in South Africa a shortage, a deficit of between 4,000 and 6,000 megawatts. The president says 4,000 megawatts is constant. Let's take the higher number, let's say 6,000 megawatts. That is what we need. Projects that are currently in procurement and construction add up to 10,000 megawatts. I'm going to say that again. The deficit that is causing load shedding is about 6,000 megawatts. Projects under construction and in procurement currently is reaching 10,000 megawatts. So it's very possible for South Africa to solve its load shedding problem over the next year or two. And you will solve it by investing huge amounts of new money. As you know, all that money will come from the private sector. A lot of it, probably as much as 45, maybe even 50%, will come from foreigners. So it will be foreign direct investment into the country. Energy is really a big game changer in South Africa, and I think one that we are underestimating. So this list here is a summary of current government policies and proposals. I'm going to stop sharing now because that's all the detail. Let me just make one more point about structural reform. Structural reform is probably the most difficult economic policy or economic change that a government can pursue. It's easy to decrease interest rates. It's also easy to just put them up. It is easy to cut taxes or to put taxes up. When you want to do structural reform, you are bound to come up against companies and vested interests whose business models will be fundamentally affected by the structural reform. And we've seen that with spectrum release. This auction that we're going to have tomorrow, hopefully, was supposed to happen last March. It's now 12 months later. Why? What has happened? Well, the vested interest went to the High Court, not once, but twice, or I think even 3 times, and they got the interdicts against the release of the spectrum, and they delayed the process. And the reason is simply that those vested interest business models will be severely disrupted by spectrum release. So why on earth should they go along with it? You know, they want to oppose it for as long as they can. We saw exactly the same thing playing itself out with renewable energy in 2014, I think it was, or 2015, when Eskom decided not to sign power purchase contracts with 27 independent power producers. And that brought South Africa's very successful independent power producers program to a screeching halt. It just stopped for 3 years or 4 years until 2018, when the Ramaphosa government, about 6 weeks after they took power, signed those contracts and got the program going again. So vested interest will always oppose the structural reform that affects their business models. That's just the nature of the game. So you need quite a strong political will. You need quite a strong and clear political will to see that through. Now, so far, that is what we've seen. We've seen it in energy, we've seen it now in spectrum, and we're seeing it in transport, harbors, and railways, a number of areas where, little bit by little bit, the country is moving forward with structural reform. Now, what is the dividend from structural reform? Well, it will be increased productivity. If we can stop load shedding in South Africa, that alone will probably give us 1.5% jump in the annual GDP growth rate. If you now add investment and the GDP impact from that onto that number, just by sorting out electricity, we can probably take that 2% growth number that Isaiah has referred to up to at least 3% over the next 2 or 3 years. So for me, Jonathan, that is the way out. That is what I currently see. If I look at politics and economics, then that is the roadmap that is lying before us. And I think it's one that holds big promise. I just want to conclude with this comparison. Isaiah has referred to economic growth rate of about 2%, and he said that was insufficient to alleviate poverty and unemployment, and that's absolutely correct. Our population growth is 1.6%. We will see after the census precisely what the number is, but at the moment it's about 1.6%. So if you grow by 2%, there's not a big margin left over. You're only talking about 0.4, maybe 0.5%. You want to get the GDP number up to over 3%, 3.5%. Then you've got a reasonable margin between people growth and economic growth. And from that margin, you can then start growing the economy. Now, 2021 was the first year in 6 years. It was the 7th year at the end of a 6-year period where per capita incomes in this country declined, where the people grew faster than the economy. It turned around in 2021, obviously from a low base. And if we can do 2% growth in 2022, as Isaiah said, well, then that's again a little bit of improvement. It's about 0.5% more than population growth. So that's good. But the trick is to get that number up to 3%. Then we will, what the Americans would say, then we're cooking with gas. But for that we need the structural reforms that I've referred to. Thanks, Jonathan.
We do have Robin Nicholson with us, and I will go to him in a second. I was planning to put Asa and JP on the line a little bit later, on the spot a little bit later. But I just want to discuss something now in terms of this. JP, I mean, it feels to me like the 10th year into a 5-year structural reform program. And South Africans are really getting a bit uptight and a bit anxious about this. And as Asa pointed out in an earlier presentation of his that I went to and attended to when he was talking for pre the budget, he said that South Africans are now they're not looking at the rhetoric of Ramaphosa and the language that he's using. They're looking at the implementation and government's ability to implement projects. And 5 of the key projects have not been implemented. And again, this year we might not see it because the ANC's have got a policy conference in June, and they've got an elective conference in December. And as Alexander Forbes pointed out, typically in those years, not much happens in terms of the implementation of these key projects. So are we going to see a waste this year? And does Ramaphosa have the political will? I mean, he's got a lot of ambitions, but can he come in with the broom, sweep it out clean of the people who are dragging their feet, and put people in there who can actually do something?
Well, you're asking a lot of questions. Let's take them one by one. I saw Isaiah's article that he wrote. I think he referred to promises from last year's State of the Nation speech, and he was analyzing in his article how many of those promises have been met and not met. My take is not so much on SONA promises. That is, of course, a a book on its own. My focus is on the issues of structural reform, the 8 that I've outlined for you. And we've seen consistent progress on the 8. I'm perfectly happy to defend them one by one. In fact, let's take electricity, Jonathan, which is which is the biggest story. 7 weeks after he became president in 2018, those 27 suspended contracts were signed, as I say, against opposition. Remember, the coal interests went to the High Court in Gauteng, and then they went to the Appeal Court in Bloemfontein in an effort to stop that. They also blockaded Tshwane, the capital city, on 2 or 3 occasions. They blockaded the highway to Mpumalanga on 1 or 2 occasions. People were really against this, but government pushed it through. In 2019, in the summer of 2019, we got an announcement by the president that Eskom will be broken up. At the time, there were 2 reactions. The one reaction was, this means nothing. It's not going to change anything. So it's really senseless. The second reaction was, yeah, this is significant. It means something, but it will never happen. Now it's 3 years later, and it's quite clear that the restructuring of Eskom is going ahead. And with that, the restructuring of the entire South African electricity industry. Did these things bring short-term relief in terms of jobs? No, it did not. Did it bring short-term relief in terms of higher economic growth? No, it did not. Will it bring those benefits, those dividends, over an extended period of time? Well, everything that we know in economics say yes. If you improve productivity, you improve investment, and you employ more people in construction and wind farms and renewable energy plants and so on, there must at some point be a spin-off. And the IMF has also said that in its report. It was quite funny, actually. On one morning, we had 2 reports from the IMF, the one, the sort of short-term economic outlook, the other, a longer-term outlook, which looked at reform. And the short-term outlook said that I think the South African economy will grow, I think, Isaiah, what was it, 1.8 to 1.9%. And in the longer-term outlook, they said we can achieve a 3% growth rate. And that's exactly the two schools that they are. And they don't exclude one another or oppose one another. The one can follow in the other. I'm perfectly happy if I just look at forensic evidence on those 8 areas. And I've said I'm happy to go through them one by one. We've seen progress. We've seen a move forward.
Yeah.
Will the elective conference and the policy conference of the ANC disrupt this? No, I don't think so at this stage. I think it's quite clear that today, on the 7th of March, Mr. Ramaphosa will get a second term. Now, in politics, 1 week is a very long time. And maybe by the 14th of March, this is not the case. That's possible. Yeah. But today, on the 7th of March, as things stand now, he will probably get a second term, and he can carry on with his work. Mr. Ramaphosa has done an enormous amount to neutralize the RET faction in the ANC, to jettison their policy proposals. Think of Section 25 of the Constitution, the property clause, and think of expropriation without compensation, where that debate has gone. Ramaphosa has really steered the ANC very, very well away from that proposition. The same thing happened around public ownership of the South African Reserve Bank. The same thing has happened around fiscal prudence and macroeconomic stability. I'm happy with his track record. I'm happy with the way that he has governed in the last 4 years. I have no doubt that these 8 items, these 8 pillars of structural reform will be implemented, and we will pick the results up. I want to be brave and say we will see the results before the 2024 election. I think the ANC and also the president, I think they are desperate to mobilize every possible thing that they can before the 2024 election. And they would like to go into that election with improved employment, improved investment, improved economic prospects, maybe even improved investment ratings. They're going to work very hard at that over the next 2 years so that they can face in 2.5 years' time the electorate. So yes, I think it will be implemented.
I'm sure that you'll agree with me before I move on to answer that key to this would be getting the key stakeholders like Andre de Ruyter from Eskom, Portia Derby from Transnet to come on board and to say, look, change their view on things like privatization, which I've spoken about in the past as being something that both Transnet and Eskom were vehemently against. I think it's Ramaphosa's ability to get these guys to start playing onside rather than offside that's going to be key to this. And look, I wouldn't want Ramaphosa's job. You can't offer me that job for all the money in the world. That he's in a very difficult position in terms of getting all the key role players to speak on the or to sing from the same hymn sheet. So I think let's look at we've had the budgets. It was positive, but a lot of economists are saying, look, you know, you are basing this budget on the fact that there are a few things that may not happen. You may not be able to keep the public service wage bill growth at 2%. It might be a lot more. So is this going to be another case of a wish list rather than an actual budget?
Look, I think if we look at what Treasury has managed to do, or let me say what government has managed to do, because sometimes there is a tendency to say it's National Treasury's decision, but the budget is not constructed by the Treasury alone. It's all the departments. There is a committee of all the ministries of which are around the economic cluster that ultimately agrees on the budget. National Treasury coordinates that. If you look at the constitutional ruling, the constitutional court ruling on the wage agreement from 2018 was quite important. It means one of the big risks as far as the wage settlements agreement, which is historical, is no longer a risk. But going forward, it is one of the fiscal anchors that government has to negotiate with labor to make sure that wage settlements are predictable and they are at a lower level such that we will have funds to do public investment. If you just consider the total purse and you look at the share of wages and salaries, it's too large in any emerging market. It's too large to almost all the countries that matter in the global economy. So it says to us there is something that needs to be done with our wages, with our productivity of the public sector that should improve our economic growth rates. I think it's going to be a difficult one, given that we are facing potentially a difficult national general elections in 2024, but also given the extreme levels of poverty that we have currently. That is being used, by labor as a bargaining chip in terms of those wage settlements. But I think over and above that, we do have an aspect of the budget that continues to worry me. The fact that economic growth is not picking up fast enough and job creation is also not happening fast enough mean that there's going to be a lot of pressure against the reform process if it does not yield results quickly enough. Because we have been given the reform agenda to say this is the only way that is sustainable where we can generate jobs and relieve poverty and unemployment. And as a result, those that have been pushing against it have given in to say, let's see this reform agenda. It's taking place, but it's too slow. At some point in time, it will be used against the reform agenda to say, we gave you time to reform the economy in the hope of getting jobs, and we are not seeing the jobs. So that can actually come back to be used against the current administration. If we don't see jobs in the next 2-3 years, then the pressure is going to mount against reforms, which for me is a big risk. But so far, I'm in agreement with JP. We have seen decisions that we would never have conceived of in the last decade being made and being implemented. Even when we look at the symbolic reduction in the corporate income tax from 28% to 27%, it's symbolic because it's only about 2.6 billion that is being given back to corporates but taken back through other means. But it says to corporates, you should not expect an increase in corporate income tax over the next couple of years. So you shouldn't worry about that aspect. But it also affirms what the president said to say private businesses must be at the center of economic revival. Government must just create the conducive environment so that private businesses, entrepreneurs, can actually thrive and create the jobs. It's affirmed. So it's not just talk. It is actions that have been put on the table that is actually happening. So in that respect, I agree that economic reforms are taking place, but they are just too slow given the social tensions that we have, which is why we're discussing things like the universal basic income grant, as a means to alleviate potential social tension. But that in itself is not sustainable. It needs just to be a temporary reprieve, which is what the budget again, pencils in. If you look at the budgeted amount as far as the COVID relief grant, it ends in March 2023, which means beyond that, it's not catered for. Jobs must take over from social relief.
On that note, we bring in Robin Nicholson. If you can start activating your camera, Robin. A lot of people say, well, why have we got an economist and why have we got a political analyst talking about this? Well, if private sector is going to play an increased role in driving reform, we have to reform our companies to be the best that they can be. And they're facing a lot of disruption outside of the economic and political sort of goings on. They're facing a lot of disruption in terms of COVID, in terms of shrinking customer base, in terms of changing business models. So, Robin, how do we take all of what JP and Isa said and apply our minds or your minds as BRPs to provide advice to companies on how to get themselves in the best position to be in a position to accommodate and to drive this growth?
Yeah, look, I think Jonathan, the question around is, what are the big drivers around where we're taking corporate South Africa right now? If we are going to have a gap of 2 to 3% in employment growth over the next 5 to 6 years, the kinds of pressures on the fiscus, I think, are going to increase. But right now, if I was looking at a large corporate as a distressed turnaround practitioner, I suppose that's the best way to put it right now, the first thing I'd say is that the distressed practitioners are themselves distressed. The Master and Supreme Court is not working well. Court rolls now, if you were to put a company into liquidation today, you can expect an unopposed application to come to court in June or July. And if it's an opposed application, it could be as late as December. Now that kind of commercial reality, when you're having a dogfight around debt, you need a far more efficient judicial system to handle it. The backlogs are just absolutely throttling the debt collection businesses. But corporates themselves, right now, if you were to try and litigate against a major supplier, I know of a particular case with a large public investment manager that is sitting with a 300 million rand exposure, and they literally can't get into court. The assets are there, but they can't secure them. By the time they can secure them, the assets will have left. So there are lots of issues around risk and volatility that are going to be even more critical to manage this year. So I know we're all busy trying to work out what happens when you emerge from lockdown. People are going back to work. There's more congestion on the roads. There's still a lot of office space that's not there. But I think one of the things that will work for people is they are re-looking at how much space and accommodation they need, and they are moving to a hybrid business model. That's going to be quite difficult. We also looked last week at what does it mean to have a war in the Ukraine. South Africa has always been a bit of an odd economy from that point of view, that we often benefit from disruptions elsewhere in the world. So we've seen the price of platinum increase. Certainly, as the world runs out of food, some of our exports are going to be in quite high demand. We don't have the kind of gold mining industry we might have had previously, which would also act as a hedge. But let's not forget the downsides. If the Americans are already facing the highest fuel price since 2008, that's really going to be a real killer for us. So we won't have fertilizer to grow the crops we need, and we won't have fuel to carry the transportation we need, and they're going to be major drivers of inflation and put even more pressure on individual businesses. So, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you look at the fact that so many of our businesses have now moved to at-home delivery services, that's going to be a big driver there as well. The other one that worries me around risk and volatility is that capital is already scarce. If you're trying to raise capital for a company that's in distress right now, it's quite a task. But once you have war, as we seem to be having in Europe now, that's going to become even harder to get capital and attractiveness. I hear JP's point that 50% will come from foreign direct investment, and that is also going to come at a price and a cost. The only thing that we know in the current environment is that the risk will even be more volatile. So if you're trying to plan a turnaround, the likelihood is that it's going to be even harder than you thought. And we all know turnarounds in South Africa don't work that well. We can take any number of them. We've seen whole industries in Middleburg Steel and Alloy just disappear. SAA is now a former fraction the size of Commie as it comes out of its business rescue. Ster-Kinekor is coming out of rescue right now, but unless people go back to theatres, that's also on a road to nowhere. And we've seen the big retailers, Edgar's has come out, seem to be doing quite well. But if you watch the retail stocks in the JSE, you can see that there are big issues because the volatility in their share price is up and down every day. Even when they present and post good results, clearly the sustainability of those results has been put in questions. So if we then, go along with the view that everything is going to be hunky-dory because we're all moving to direct-to-home distribution, you have to ask why Massmart and Macro have just announced one of the biggest store build-out programs that they've ever had in this country. They clearly believe that the future of retail is mass marketing, and that people will travel to destination venues where they can get value. So it's not an easy market to read right now. It's what's going to happen. The other one I think that's going to cause people a great deal of difficulty is related to that is where is your brand and what is your positioning? People have forgotten about their brands. They haven't experienced things like going to the movies, to take an example, for over 2 years. And people forget those kinds of things very quickly. Is your favorite pub still there? Or has it also left the country, as so many of the operators in that industry have? We then look at, how are we going to revive the travel and leisure industry as a safe destination? It's a big positive for us right now. But you certainly need a lot more focus from government in that sector. And the ministry has not done a great job in reviving it or given a strategic plan for where travel is actually going in this country. I mean, last week they had a big Meetings Africa, which is where the whole supply chain for the tourism and leisure industry converges in Sandton. And it was poorly attended, which points to an indication that there aren't as many venues out there as there were. And even there, where they are, the owners are saying, just wait a second, let's find out exactly what's going on in this business before we start making investments in conferences and rebuilding these big networks. I think the next big one is to say, this is also building on what JP said, and as I said earlier, the thing that as we emerge from COVID is going to become quite apparent. You have to move beyond cost cutting to redirecting your areas of investment. And that's particularly relevant in state institutions and those SOE. So one, for example, for me, PRASA, will they sell off the Cape Town lines to the municipality, or to a private operator? They haven't been able to get those lines to work for almost 6 years now. How do you position those businesses from their sunset positioning to sunrise industries? So if you look at the way they're handling the SABC right now, JP made the point that the spectrum is coming up for auction soon. The minister is also pushing the switch off of DTT, switch off of analog terrestrial later this month, DSTV has taken, sorry, not DSTV, ETV has taken them to court, protecting their position, and the SABC has been very cagey about it. But if you look at where the SABC is positioned right now, as they've started to switch off analog, it's lost 20% of its market in listenership in the areas that it's been switched off, simply because they don't have access to television. That's going to cause a lot of political fallout in its own case. But there's no clear case to reposition the SABC as a content provider in an online environment where it can compete irrespective of its distribution methodology. If you look at the SABC, and I can speak with some authority on it, it's a content aggregator and a distributor on all platforms, but it doesn't seem to get the last bit right. Right now, it's got a shrinking analog footprint. It's not getting digital set-top boxes out to its audiences. They've got to make R1,000 investment, and these are the same households that are getting by on 350 Rand a month. So it's that kind of lack of integrated thinking, I think, that's going to catch us up in a lot of the implementation of what's going on right now. I think the other thing a lot of businesses will focus on in the next year is on their systems and process investments to drive productivity and use output measures. If you look at a lot of the big matrices in the mining industry, it is about cost, cost per ton, trying to drive more tons at the same cost. But I think the big thing for around the critical investments is, what are we doing about new industries? JP, I hear you say that there are 8 pillars for the structural reform. But if you look at the modern science industries, where these startups are, and are they being funded with sufficient seed capital? So although you might well be looking for the next Elon Musk, those new sciences, particularly around agriculture and food production, are a point where we've always a very strong science-based agriculture in our various universities. And do we have incubators that can really bring them to market? The one that I always know is, do we revive our old fertilizer businesses? There's certain dormant plants laying all over this country that made fertilizer for years. We don't seem to be making the right mining investments to replace declining capacity. If you look at the state of play in the coal mining industry, you're still stuck with 2 or 3 large producers of coal. The old Kroonfontein and Optimum collieries are still standing still because we can't seem to settle the Gupta issues. The other one that does excite me quite a lot, and that's just because I've had an opportunity to work with Amplats recently, is around hydrogen. We should be putting real to hydrogen right now. We're one of 5 countries that can actually export hydrogen production, because it's, you take solar. So should that not be a key part of our industry going forward? Should we not produce motor vehicles? How many of our big universities are really driving that? The government's facing and putting its investment in Polokwane require an investment. This is not about making investment in Polokwane, but if you look at the big 5 STEM research universities in this country, it's not Turfloop. It is UCT, Stellenbosch, Wits, Pretoria, and Durban. Whether you like it or not, that's where the intellectual capacity of the country sits, and it needs to be exploited, in my view, around hydrogen and the green and solar industries, and then, of course, the ocean economy, which I won't say much about because I know very little about it. I'll leave that to the people that live closer to it. I think the other big trend that's going to become quite apparent this year is managing your people. COVID was a rushed movement to online business. We sent people home, and now we're simply saying, come back to work, but they've all learned to live different lifestyles over the last 2 years. So a case in point, this leads to this phenomenon. I don't know if Isaiah has seen it or if JP has seen it in their walk around, but the great mass resignations that are taking place. So someone like Deloitte is actually restructuring its entire consultancy business to focus on fewer larger clients and releasing a lot of resource into the marketplace because they've been unable to service those they call it mid 50 million to 150 million turnover companies, where they're simply walking away from that space. Because the people don't want to do that work. They can't move the people around the world, and they're battling with this remote working model. So although they bought and built a great big business in Midrand right now, that office is mostly empty. I think the other one that we can all know about, because our colleagues see it, is battle stress for executives is quite clear. Now, people are getting tired and burnt out and resigning and leaving and going to farm much earlier in their careers. Moving back face-to-face requires the reintroduction of co-workers and culture. It's not easy when people haven't seen each other for 2 years to suddenly put them back in a room and get them to work as a team. Even if, I was reading some stuff from Harvard Business Review on hybrid leadership. They even at that level, they battled with it. And they used to have had a sort of idea of and build a culture. It's not received the focus, certainly. Of course, there is a thing about how do you move from a pandemic to an endemic disease, and how do you manage in the workplace? I think there we are quite well positioned, actually, because we do know how to manage HIV and AIDS amongst our workforce, and we haven't had the kind of productivity disaster we expected in the early 1990s and 2000s from HIV and AIDS. And then the last one, I think, that we're really going to see a big crunch on it is liquidity at all times. Working capital management is going to remain key. Debtors. This is, we certainly from where we sit as distressed practitioners and we talk to debt collectors on a regular basis. The debtors book is moving out again. It used to run at about, in a good, healthy environment, 38 days, and it sort of moved to 45, then to 60, and now it's 20, so just work that out. If you've got 100 million rand in your book, you need 2.1 million to finance the interest cost of that. So if you try and run that down every 10 days, you've got to find, as an economy, a big chunk of change to finance your working capital in your debtors book. Stock, we've heard the Russians say that, we've seen Ford, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Renault all come out and say their supply chain from Eastern Europe is going to be severely affected by the war in Ukraine. We've got a large manufacturing industry in this country. So on the one hand, you might not be able to get the Renault, but you might be able to build it. And I certainly think the Russian disruption to markets and cash flows is only going to emerge over the next 90 days. We are going to see and there are some really big industries where the Russians have a big presence in this country. So they own what's left of Arfeld steel and vanadium. They own the nickel industry in the country. They've got big investments in other emerging mining operations that were due to come online over the next 2 years. So I think that, we really should focus on the short-term working capital. So I think the big things are for us: manage your risk and volatility. It's going to be even more critical. Work on reestablishing your brands and positioning. Watch where you put your capital around critical investments. There are so many opportunities and good opportunities that perhaps you should prioritize that. Move from this view that it's a burnt out basket case to the actual view that the emerging technologies that are coming forward now provide great opportunities for investment. But most of all, managing your human capital is going to be more critical than it was over the last year. But be very, very careful. Short-term cash flows are under pressure, and they're going to come under more and more pressure in the course of this year. It's not going to go away.
Robin, thank you very much. You spoke about companies getting put out to pasture.
Macroeconomics might be coming right. If you haven't got wages at the end, you're going to have a very violent strike.
Robin, thank you very much.
Sure.
you spoke about putting companies out to pasture, and a lot of companies in COVID been putting companies out to pasture. Before Eskom and in the internet puts us out to pasture, as we have seen today, let me wrap up by thanking everybody for joining us today. A copy of this roundtable will be available on the Turnaround Talk website. Asa, Robin, and JP, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your patience in the technology issues that we experienced at the beginning of this. Hopefully, the next time that we engage and catch up with all of you, we will not have these problems, and we will be able to engage on a more positive note.